In this video, I'll explain why I'm giving the latest installment in the Total War franchise, Pharaoh, a 6 out of 10. I put a big focus on whether or not Total War Pharaoh is worth the $60 price tag I paid, and spoiler alert, it's not worth the $60. So if you really want it, I'd wait for a significant sale. There's definitely some positives and aspects of this Total War that takes place during the historical collapse of the Late Bronze Age, which I think made it a bit better in some areas such as diplomacy, and all the other Total Wars I've played from Warhammer 3 to the first Shogun. However, it failed to meet my baseline expectations of a Total War game. First, the accessibility and settings are actually quite nice. The typical adjustments for video and audio settings are there, and in addition to those, which I love, are options for those with different types of color blindness, such as deuteranopia, protanopia, and trianopia, which is a major plus and one I would love to see in other games. The game offers a variety of tutorials and help options for those who may be newer or returning Total War players, which is nice. Performance-wise, you don't really need to do any tweaking for the graphics, even on an older graphics card like a 2080 Ti, which I used, unless you plan to live stream and record your gameplay at the same time, which may produce stuttering issues, at least it did for me, like a few of the other Total Wars such as the 3 Warhammers or 3 Kingdoms. The basic UI or RTS heads-up display during battles one could expect from any recent Total War game is present in Pharaoh, of course, with a stylistic and thematic twist that's set in what one could refer to as the ancient Middle East. The user experience is just as what you'd expect again from a Total War game. Nothing much has been changed or vastly revolutionized in terms of menu interface or the actual gameplay, such as repositioning or selecting units. There isn't anything really complicated you wouldn't be able to understand without reading some in-game tooltips or just looking up some of the keybind options in the game. If this is your first Total War game, it might be a little overwhelming just as any semi-RTS, 4X element, or turn-based game would be, whether we're talking about Stellaris or even Humankind. But the game offers sometimes a bit too much help on this front, so you don't need to worry about being not able to get into it from a technical standpoint. The Total War developers basically also know that if their long-tried UI and user experience works, it works. No need to reinvent the wheel, and they don't attempt to do so apart from indicating newly thought of game mechanics such as a weather system, Pillars of Civilization, or Royal Court System Go, which can be confined to small buttons or displays that doesn't really interrupt the flow of the UI. As one chatter put it during one of my live streams, the idle music during the campaign map play can be relaxing. The battle and menu music definitely gives a lot of Assassin's Creed Mirage vibes, which we also made a review on. While it's not the best music, it's certainly decent enough to get you immersed in some of the RTS moments. Audio feedback from interacting with options or mechanics in the game, such as selecting or ordering units, is again what you expect from a Total War game. Battle audio effects are initially satisfying, especially when disastrous weather mechanics start occurring, but the din of battle with a noticeable lack of screams, bodies, and weapons clashing leaves something to be desired compared to Shogun 2 or even Rome 2. As a historian, I've enjoyed the many historical settings and backdrops, however they were reimagined or embellished by the Total War developers over the many years of playing their installments. While in some cases, such as Rome 2 or Total War Napoleon, the limitations of the game clearly couldn't convey the enormous weight of a lot of the actual historical battles, the bare bones of what they could have been like was at least conveyed. The same goes for Total War Pharaoh, where the sunsetting of the 19th Egyptian dynasty in the greater context of the late Bronze Age collapse is also reimagined and delivered to the player artistically. While historically we don't know for sure even today what caused the collapse of several late Bronze Age city-states and civilizations, whether it be famine, cultural shifts, wars, natural disasters, sicknesses, and so on, Total War Pharaoh basically throws all of the potential factors and theories into the mix and tell us go ahead and experience it. The sense of impending doom or hopelessness, particularly once you reach endgame, can be felt, and I think that's certainly a plus for the setting of the game. The graphics, art, and environment are of course well done, and attempts to stay true to history while not being there at all, particularly when it comes to said environment, can be forgiven for the resulting art. Graphically, it's a beautiful Total War game, although some of the assets for the military units could have been better. Camera movement offers 3 different settings for players in Pharaoh, which is nice. The pacing of the game certainly is a lot different, a lot faster and urgent compared to many other Total War games. After turn 10 or 15, you can definitely get overwhelmed at first by the multiple new systems that developers have put in for Pharaoh. Like the weather system I hope we get to see in the larger upcoming installment for Total War, just as it was done for elements of Total War Thrones of Britannia for Total War 3 Kingdoms, or Total War Empire for Napoleon, Total War Rome 2 for Attila, and so on. The construction of resource posts or fortifications and such on the campaign map itself was a neat idea, which I felt was somewhat borrowed from Total War Empire's colleges and resource posts that enemies could raid or destroy, albeit, in Pharaoh's case, without agents. There are, of course, other systems that I wouldn't like to see that I felt clashed with the typical Total War gameplay, or even Pharaoh in this case, such as workforce being a requirement to build despite you possessing enough resources to build those things. Compared to other Total Wars, diplomacy, at least early to mid-game in Pharaoh, is an absolute must. The game pushes you into engaging in diplomacy with other factions, as it's the best way to acquire enough or surplus resources to sustain your expansion or military upkeep. Just like Total War Troy, instead of the game automatically regulating trade for an increase in gold or primary currency, your trade agreements or barter agreements through diplomacy must be manually allotted for the specific resources you need, such as food, bronze, lumber, stone, and gold. The tech tree is actually quite nice as well. It may be one of the more exciting parts of Pharaoh, but the tech tree also forces diplomacy to a degree, as some of the really good ones require you to uphold alliances or fulfill other diplomatic prerequisites for those techs to be active once you gain them. Simply put, Pharaoh doesn't give you much of an option to be self-reliant early on through a combination of resource and territorial management, which are always under threat by hostile forces or map events, such as famines and such. And while this is fine in the vacuum, again, something like this often clashes with the pacing of Pharaoh, which just doesn't feel good at all to play through at times. Unfortunately, it's at this point where a lot of Total War Pharaoh's failings come to light after playing a considerable amount. I would say a lot of the negatives lie in the poor combat balancing, particularly on the harder difficulties, within the context of the endgame catastrophes, such as invading sea peoples. Siege battles feel like more of a chore than usual compared to other Total Wars, which is an amazing accomplishment. The length of battles can be way too overdrawn as a result of morale boosting or armor ratings, which is another mechanic added to Pharaoh by the way. The end result is you basically just watch a standstill battle, even if you outwit, outgun, and outflank enemies, which doesn't make the progression of you unlocking better tech or units feel rewarding at all. The RTS element or battles of Total War Pharaoh feel very drowned out by the campaign map, which honestly takes up too much of your time, whereas in previous Total Wars it felt like there was a healthy balance between the battles and the campaign map. Of course, there comes a point in time where a lot of us do automatic resolves for field battles, particularly for the easier ones, but that usually comes in late game when you've done or seen everything with all units, and this may be the first Total War where I would rather just automatically resolve every battle than play some or most of them just because of the terrible combat balancing, unnecessarily longer fights, and the poor variety in units. Lastly, it's a bit disappointing to see in this installment, but there are no naval battles, and any naval battle engagement is simply fought on land, if you decide to manually take control. As for the Hittites and Canaanites, it feels like these factions were an afterthought after the Egyptian factions were fleshed out, and they just didn't feel great to play. After the first week of playing around with things on different settings and as different factions and getting to the end game of mitigating the late Bronze Age collapse for my factions, unlike a lot of the other Total War games and more similarly to Total War Troy or Total War Thrones of Britannia, I just did not become more engaged as time went on. I didn't really enjoy playing much or even enjoy the prospect of replaying as I have for other Total War games. As for multiplayer, well, as of making this video, it's pretty much dead or empty. I just do not think Total War Pharaoh is worth shelling out $60 for when there are so many other good games in 2023 and upcoming you could pay the same or similar amount for and enjoy for far more. And if you're an avid Total War enjoyer like myself, I can promise you that you won't be missing out on much, and that just like some of these smaller installments in the past, Total War Pharaoh is just a small stepping stone or a sandbox of ideas that the developers are testing out, I feel like, for the larger installments in the future. While I appreciate an attempt to return to a more historical backdrop for Total War games after the recent conclusion of the Total War Warhammer trilogy, I felt like this one was just a miss in the end. Let me know what you guys think about Total War Pharaoh if you've played the game, or let me know down in the comments below what game you'd want me to review next. If you want more game reviews, lore videos, and more content, definitely subscribe to the channel. See you guys next time, and stay safe out there.